The rain over the city that October was thin and constant, the kind that didn't fall so much as hang in the air, soaking into everything slowly.
He never saw her coming. Vittorio Salvano, the man 3 police commissioners were too afraid to touch, the man who buried his enemies before they even knew they were at war. He let a stranger walk into his house, hand her his son, and trust her with the only soft thing left in his life. What he didn't know was that the woman teaching his blind boy to see the world again was the daughter of the family he blamed for his wife's murder. She hadn't come to heal his son. She had come to destroy him. But somewhere between the piano lessons and the walks through the garden, between a boy learning to trust the dark and a woman learning to hate a man she was supposed to hate on principle, the plan started to fall apart. This is the story of Elena Rossi and the house she was never supposed to fall in love with. The rain over the city that October was thin and constant, the kind that didn't fall so much as hang in the air, soaking into everything slowly. Elena stood outside the iron gates of the Salvano estate for almost 4 minutes before she pressed the buzzer, and in those 4 minutes she rehearsed her name until it stopped feeling like a lie. Elena Marino, 26, certified in early childhood development, 2 years of experience with visually impaired children at a private clinic upstate. All of it printed on crisp paper folded in her bag, all of it fake except the skill itself, which was real, because her handlers had insisted the fastest way to get caught was to fake competence, not just a name. She had grown up hearing 2 words spoken like a curse in her father's house. Salvano did this. Her mother had said it the night her older brother didn't come home. Her uncles had said it over a card table stained with old blood money. Salvano did this. Salvano did that. Salvano took what was ours and salted the earth behind him. Elena had been raised inside that sentence the way other children were raised inside prayers. So when her father, Salvatore Rossi, called her into his study 8 weeks ago and told her the Salvano house needed a nanny and that the position had just opened because the previous woman had quit without explanation, Elena had understood immediately what he was really asking. Not to care for a child, to get inside. You go in, you listen. You find where he keeps the ledgers, and you find out who really pulled the trigger on your brother, her father had said, sliding a manila folder across the desk. And you do not, under any circumstance, get close to that man. She had not expected the boy. The gate buzzed open, and a guard the size of a delivery truck walked her up the gravel drive without a word. The house itself rose out of the rain like something built to be feared before it was built to be lived in, gray stone, black shutters, cameras tucked into corners that pretended to be architectural details. But when the front door opened, it wasn't a bodyguard who greeted her first. It was a small voice. "Are you the new one?" Elena looked down. A boy stood just inside the doorway, maybe 7 or 8, with dark curls that needed cutting, and a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't so guarded, so careful, the face of a child who had learned to arrange his features before anyone could read them. His eyes were the strangest part. A pale, clouded hazel, fixed slightly to the left of where Elena actually stood, unmoving, unfocused. Matteo Salvano, blind since the night his mother died, according to the file. The file hadn't said how young he'd sounded when he asked the question, like he was bracing to be disappointed again. "I'm the new one," Elena said, crouching without thinking about it, bringing her voice level with his. "My name's Elena. The last one lasted 6 days," Matteo said. She cried in the kitchen. I could hear her through the wall. "I don't cry in kitchens," Elena said. "I cry in cars, mostly. Much more private." For a moment nothing happened. Then the corner of the boy's mouth twitched, fighting a smile it clearly hadn't been given permission to have, and something in Elena's chest, something she hadn't accounted for in any of her father's careful planning, cracked open just slightly and let a small, unwelcome warmth in. That was when she heard the footsteps behind him, unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had never in his life needed to walk quickly toward anything because everything came to him instead. Vittorio Salvano was taller than his photograph suggested and colder. He wore no jacket, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and there was a scar along his jaw that the pictures hadn't caught. Thin and old, the kind of scar a man keeps because removing it would mean admitting it happened. He looked at Elena the way she imagined he looked at ledgers, searching for the number that didn't add up. "You're early," he said. Not a greeting. An observation filed away. "I like to see a place in daylight before I commit to it," Elena said, and immediately regretted the word commit, because his eyes narrowed slightly, cataloging it. "Come inside before you drown out there," he said instead, and stepped back to let her pass. And Elena walked into the house of the man she had been sent to destroy, feeling the boy's small, dry hand slip into hers as though it belonged there, as though he had decided, on the strength of one joke about crying in cars, that she was his. The interview, if it could be called that, took place in a study lined with books Elena doubted anyone had read, Vittorio behind a desk too large for the room, Matteo sitting cross-legged on the rug with his hands, moving over the raised dots of a Braille picture book, not reading it so much as touching it, the way some children hum to themselves. "He's had 4 nannies in 2 years, Vittorio said. "The house frightens them. My business frightens them. Or they get soft with him, treat him like something broken, and he hates that more than anything." He said it flatly, but his eyes flicked once, briefly, to his son, and Elena caught something there she hadn't expected to find in a man like him. Not softness exactly, but its scaffolding, the shape softness would take if it were ever allowed to stand. "I don't think he's broken," Elena said. "I think he's had to build a whole different way of understanding a world that stopped explaining itself to him one day. That's not broken. That's just harder." Vittorio studied her for a long moment, long enough that Elena forced herself not to look away, not to give him the satisfaction of watching her flinch first. "What happened to his mother," he said, "is not something we discuss in this house. Not with him. Not with the staff. Not with you." "Understood," Elena said, and meant it as a lie, because understanding exactly what happened to Isabella Salvano was the entire reason she was sitting in that chair. "You start tomorrow," Vittorio said. "Rosetta will show you the East Rooms. You'll live here during the week. Weekends are your own, though you'll forgive me if my men verify where you spend them." It wasn't a request for permission. It was a statement of fact, delivered the way he probably delivered every fact in his life, and Elena nodded, filing it away the way she filed everything now, as information for her father, as a wall she'd need to find a door through. She should have felt triumphant. She had gotten in on the first try, easier than she dared to plan for. Instead, walking down the hallway behind Rosetta the housekeeper, she felt Matteo's hand find hers again without being asked, small fingers curling around 2 of her own, and she felt something far more complicated than triumph settle into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples she couldn't yet see the edges of. The first 2 weeks were, on the surface, exactly what her father's plan had required. Elena learned the rhythm of the house, the guards who rotated at the gate every 6 hours, the black car that left every Tuesday and Thursday at 11 and returned 4 hours later, the office on the 2nd floor that Vittorio kept locked even when he was inside it, the safe she glimpsed once behind a painting when a maid forgot to close a door. She memorized names. Marco, the man who never smiled, who Vittorio trusted with things he trusted no one else with. Renata, the accountant who came twice a month with a briefcase she guarded like it contained her own heartbeat. Elena wrote nothing down. She had learned young that paper was the first thing that got you caught. She simply watched and remembered, and every other Sunday, in a coffee shop 3 towns over where her father's driver waited outside, she recited what she'd seen to a man who listened without ever once asking how the boy was doing. But underneath the surface, something else was happening, something Elena hadn't planned for and didn't know how to stop. Matteo did not simply accept her. He collected her, the way a child collects a favorite stone, turning her over and over to learn every texture of her. He learned the particular rhythm of her footsteps, so he always knew it was her before she spoke. He learned that she wore a bracelet that made a small sound, 3 thin metal rings that clicked together when she moved her wrist, and he would reach for the sound before he reached for her hand, delighted every time by his own accuracy. In the 3rd week, Elena began teaching him what she had actually trained to teach, back before her father's plans had repurposed her skills into a weapon, not pity, not caution, but a different kind of seeing. She brought him into the garden on a gray Tuesday afternoon and knelt him down in front of a rose bush. "Don't touch the flower first," she told him. "Touch the stem. Feel how it's rough, almost like tiny hooks. That's how the plant protects the flower. Now go up, slow, until it changes." Matteo's small fingers climbed the stem with a concentration that made Elena's throat tighten unexpectedly, and when they reached the bloom itself, when the coarse green gave way suddenly to something impossibly soft, his whole face opened, unguarded for the first time since she'd met him. "It's like the outside is armor," he said, "and the inside is a secret." "Yes," Elena said, and had to look away from him for a moment, out at the gray garden, because the boy had just described, without knowing it, every single person in his father's house, including, especially herself. She taught him to read a room by sound alone, the particular hush that meant his father had entered it, the different hush that meant a stranger had. She taught him to identify footsteps by weight and pace, a skill she recognized, with some discomfort, as identical to the ones her own training had given her, just aimed in the opposite direction, not toward danger, but away from it, toward safety, toward a boy learning to build a map of a world that had gone dark on him overnight. She brought him a small recorder and had him catalog sounds: rain on the greenhouse glass, the specific creak of the third stair, his father's laugh, which she noted he had almost no recordings of because it happened so rarely. "Play me the one where he laughs," she said one evening, and Mateo pressed the button, and out came 4 full seconds of a sound so unguarded, so entirely unlike the man Elena had interviewed with, that she felt the ground under her plan shift another half-inch. "When was that?" she asked. "My birthday. 2 years ago." Before. Mateo didn't finish the sentence. He never finished sentences that ended near his mother's death, the way a person avoids stepping on a specific crack in a sidewalk without ever admitting why. Elena began, against every instruction her father had given her, to see Vittorio Salvano twice. Once, as the file described him, a man with blood enough on his hands to fill a lake, and once as she actually watched him move through his own house, a man who sat outside his son's door some nights and didn't go in, because he didn't know what to say to a child he couldn't fix, a man whose hands, she noticed one evening, shook very slightly when he thought no one was watching, pouring a whiskey he mostly didn't drink. There were other lessons too, smaller ones, the kind that don't sound like much when you list them but that build a person back up one brick at a time. Elena taught Mateo to pour his own water by listening for the pitch of the stream as it rose in the glass, so that he never again had to ask a staff member to fill it for him and endure the quiet, well-meaning pity that came with being served. She taught him to fold his own laundry by touch, sorting by fabric weight and seam pattern instead of color, a system he became so proud of that he insisted on demonstrating it to Rosetta, who cried a little in the hallway afterward, though this time Elena suspected they weren't the kind of tears the last nanny used to cry. She taught him chess using a board with raised squares and different shaped pieces, and within 3 weeks he was beating Marco regularly, which the big man took with far better grace than anyone expected, growling out a laugh each time and swearing, in Italian, that the boy had inherited his father's instinct for knowing exactly when to strike. It was during one of those chess games, Mateo's small fingers hovering thoughtfully over a bishop, that Marco first looked at Elena with something other than the polite indifference he'd shown her for weeks. "You're not like the others," he said, not looking up from the board. It wasn't a compliment, not exactly. It was an observation, filed away the same careful way Vittorio filed things, and Elena understood in that moment that Marco had been watching her as closely as his boss had, perhaps longer, perhaps from the very first day. "Is that a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice light. "Depends what you're not like them for," Marco said, and moved his knight, and said nothing further, but Elena felt the weight of the question follow her out of the room, and she began, after that, to be more careful about which doors she lingered near and which questions she let herself ask aloud, though by then it was already too late to undo the 10 weeks of watching that had come before. It was in the 5th week that Vittorio began, without ceremony, appearing where she was. At first she told herself it was coincidence. He would be in the study when she brought Mateo through with his lesson materials. He would be in the hallway when she carried the boys' dinner tray up. But coincidence has a rhythm, and Elena had been trained to notice rhythms, and by the 2nd week of it, she understood that Vittorio Salvano was finding excuses to be near a woman he had hired to care for his son, and that understanding sat in her stomach like a stone she couldn't decide whether to swallow or spit back out. "You're good with him," Vittorio said one night, standing in the doorway of the small sitting room where Elena was reading Mateo a story, low and quiet, the boy asleep against a cushion. The others were careful with him. "You're not careful. You let him climb the stairs on his own. You let him hold the knife when he helps in the kitchen. He needs to trust his own hands," Elena said, "more than he needs to be protected from every edge in the world. His mother used to say something like that. Vittorio's voice had gone somewhere else, somewhere Elena hadn't heard it go before, somewhere unguarded. She thought I cuddled him even before. He stopped himself the way his son stopped himself, the exact same crack in the exact same sidewalk. She would have liked you, he said instead, and it landed in the room like something dropped from a height, and neither of them picked it back up. Elena told herself, walking to her room that night, that this was good. This was access. A man who trusted her, who let his guard slip in small, unwitting pieces, was a man whose secrets she could eventually reach. She told herself this so firmly, so many times, that she almost believed it was the only reason her hands were shaking when she closed her door. She met her father on the second Sunday of the 7th week, in the same coffee shop, and for the first time in 2 months, she found herself editing what she said before she said it. She told him about the guard rotations. She told him about Tuesday's car and Thursday's car. She did not tell him about the roses, or the recorder, or the 4 seconds of laughter, or the way Vittorio Salvano had started leaving his study door open in the evenings, as though inviting a conversation he'd never admit to wanting. You found nothing about the accountant, her father said. It wasn't a question. Nothing about the night your brother. I need more time, Elena said. If I push, he'll notice. He notices everything. Her father studied her the way Vittorio had studied her weeks ago in that first interview, searching for the number that didn't add up. And Elena forced herself to hold his gaze the same way she'd forced herself to hold Vittorio's. 2 more weeks, her father said finally. And Elena, do not forget whose daughter you are in that house. She didn't answer, because she was no longer entirely sure how to. It was in the 9th week that everything the plan had never accounted for came due at once. Matteo had begun, in the last month, to speak more, laugh more, ask for things he wouldn't have asked for before. A second story at bedtime, a walk in the rain because he liked the sound of it on his skin, a chance to help Elena set the table by feeling for the plate setting she taught him, 3 fingers from the edge, always 3. On a Thursday evening, with Vittorio unexpectedly home early from whatever business had taken the black car out that afternoon, the 3 of them ended up at the same table for dinner for the first time, an accident of scheduling that none of them commented on and none of them undid. Matteo, delighted by the novelty, insisted on setting the table himself, and Vittorio watched his son's hands move with the careful, practiced confidence Elena had taught him, watched him find the fork 3 fingers from the plate's edge without a single misstep, and something in the man's face came undone in a way Elena had never seen. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of grief so old and so carefully buttoned that watching it come loose felt like witnessing something private, something she had no right to see and couldn't look away from anyway. Isabetta used to set the table like that, Vittorio said quietly, to no one to the room. 3 fingers. She said if you couldn't find your fork without looking, the meal wasn't worth having. Mama used to do that. Matteo went very still, the way he did when he was afraid a good thing would evaporate if he moved too fast. Every night, Vittorio said, and for the first time since Elena had arrived in that house, he smiled without the scar on his jaw pulling tight with old effort, an easy smile, a real one, and it undid something in Elena that she had spent 9 weeks trying very hard to keep tied down. Later that night, after Matteo was asleep, Elena found Vittorio on the back terrace, alone, a glass of whiskey untouched on the railing beside him, looking out at the dark garden where the roses had gone black and shapeless in the night. "Thank you," he said without turning around, as though he'd known her footsteps before she reached the door, the way Matteo did, for giving him that back. "I didn't know how." "You didn't lose it," Elena said, standing beside him at a distance that felt, suddenly, entirely too small. "You just didn't know it was still there." "I don't know how to be soft with him," Vittorio said. "I know how to protect him. I know how to make sure nothing ever touches him again. I don't know how to just be his father the way I was before she." The sentence went unfinished again, but this time he turned to look at Elena directly, and his eyes in the low light were not the eyes of the man who had interviewed her 9 weeks ago, cataloging her like a ledger entry. They were simply the eyes of a man, tired, unguarded, asking a question he didn't have words for. "Tell me what happened to her," Elena said, before she could stop herself, and hated herself instantly for the way the question came out. Not as her father's spy asking for a confession, but as a woman who had watched this man's grief crack open at a dinner table and wanted, desperately, and against every instruction she'd ever been given, to understand it rather than exploit it. Vittorio was quiet for a long moment. "The Rossi family," he said finally, the name landing in Elena's chest like a dropped stone, "took something from me that I will never get back. I have spent 2 years making sure they understand the cost of that. I don't discuss it further than this. Not with staff. Not with anyone." He looked at her, and something in his gaze sharpened, just slightly, an old habit of suspicion reasserting itself even through the grief. "Why do you ask?" "Because I watch you not answer that question every single day," Elena said carefully, "and I watch it cost you something every single time." It was true. It was also, she realized as she said it, the closest she had come in 9 weeks to telling him the truth about herself. Not the facts, but the shape of them, the fact that she, too, was carrying a name that cost her something every time it went unspoken. Vittorio didn't answer. He simply looked at her for a long time, the whiskey still untouched on the railing, the garden black and quiet below them, and something passed between them that neither of them had planned for and neither of them knew how to name. And Elena went to bed that night with her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with the terrible, undeniable fact that she was starting to feel something for the man she had been sent to ruin. There was a night, near the end of that 9th week, that Elena would return to often in her mind afterward, turning it over the way Matteo turned over a stone, trying to find the exact moment the plan had truly broken. Vittorio had come to find her in the small library where she read to Matteo most evenings, but the boy had already gone to sleep, and instead of leaving, Vittorio had sat down across from her in the second armchair, the one that had always seemed reserved for Isabetta's memory rather than any living person, and asked her, quietly, to tell him something true about herself, something that had nothing to do with his son. "Why?" Elena had asked, startled by the request. "Because in 9 weeks I've learned everything about how you handle my child and almost nothing about who you are when you're not handling him," Vittorio said. "I'd like to know the second thing." So she told him, not the truth that mattered, not the name or the folder or the war waiting to happen, but smaller truths, the kind she hadn't spoken aloud in years, that she had wanted, before her family's business swallowed every other plan she'd had, to work with children exactly like Matteo. That she used to sit in on classes for the visually impaired as a teenager because her cousin had gone blind after a fever and no one else in the family had known how to talk to him, that she had a scar on her knee from falling off a bicycle at 11 that her mother, gone now for 6 years, used to trace absently whenever Elena sat near her, an old habit of comfort neither of them had ever named. Vittorio listened the way she had taught his son to listen, fully, without interrupting, without reaching for his phone or his glass, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment. "Isabetta would have liked you," he said again, the second time he'd said it, and this time it didn't sound like a man comparing a new nanny to his dead wife. It sounded like a man giving Elena something he didn't give easily, permission to exist in his house as more than a hired stranger, to exist, however briefly, as someone he could imagine choosing. Elena went back to her room that night and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without moving. The recorder Matteo had given her sitting silent on the nightstand, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than any of the danger her father's plan had ever put her in, that she was no longer entirely certain which version of her life she wanted to walk out of that house with. She should have told her father to pull her out. She knew this, lying awake that night, staring at the ceiling of a room in a house that was starting to feel less like a target and more, impossibly, dangerously, like somewhere she belonged. She should have called the number she was never supposed to use except in emergencies and said the 2 words that would end it. Too close, and let someone else finish what she'd started. Instead, she lay awake turning the recorder Matteo had given her over in her hands, the one with the 4 seconds of his father's laugh, and thought about roses and armor and secrets, and did not make the call. The 10th week broke everything open, the way these things always do, not with a plan but with an accident. Elena had gone into the second-floor office to retrieve a book Matteo wanted, a Braille atlas Vittorio kept for him in a drawer, and the office door, for the first time in 10 weeks, had been left unlocked. She told herself, standing in the doorway, that she was only going to get the atlas. She told herself this even as her eyes moved across the desk, even as her hand found the edge of a folder she had no business touching, even as she opened it and saw, in her father's handwriting, in her own family's coded shorthand copied crudely into a photograph of a ledger page, proof that the Rossi family had not simply been the victim of the Salvano War 2 years ago. They had started it. The photograph was a copy of a shipment manifest, dated the week before Isabella Salvano died, her father's signature at the bottom, arranging a hit that had gone wrong, that had killed the wrong car, the wrong woman, a mistake so catastrophic that her father had spent 2 years letting the world believe the Salvano family had struck first, letting Elena herself believe it, sending his own daughter into this house, not to gather evidence of Vittorio's crimes, but to make certain no one ever found evidence of his own. Elena stood frozen in that office with the folder in her shaking hands, and she heard, too late, the particular weight and pace of footsteps she had spent 10 weeks teaching a blind boy to recognize. Footsteps, she recognized herself now without needing to look up. "That," Vittorio said from the doorway, his voice gone entirely still in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, "is not the Atlas." Elena turned. There was no version of this moment where a lie would hold, and she knew it. And something in her, something that had been growing quietly for 10 weeks among the roses and the recorded laughter and the 3 fingers from the edge, refused to try one anyway. "My name isn't Elena Marino," she said. "It's Elena Rossi, Salvatore Rossi's daughter. My father sent me here to find out what really happened to your wife." She watched his face change, watched the grief and the strange, unguarded warmth of the last 2 weeks harden back into the man who had interviewed her, the man who buried enemies before they knew they were at war. "And I just found out he lied to me," she said. "He started it, Vittorio. The hit that killed Isabella, it was his. I didn't know. I swear to you I did not know." For a long, terrible moment, Vittorio said nothing at all, and Elena understood, standing in that office with the folder still in her hands, that she had just handed the most dangerous man she had ever met both a weapon against her family and the truth he had spent 2 years hunting for, and she had no idea, none at all, which one he would reach for first. "Marco," Vittorio said, not raising his voice, and the big man appeared in the doorway behind him as though he'd been standing there the whole time, which perhaps he had. "Take her to the East Room. Lock it. No one goes in or out until I say otherwise." He looked at Elena one last time, and his eyes had gone somewhere cold and close that she recognized from the very first day. The ledger eyes, the eyes of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. "Not even Matteo," he said, and walked out, and Elena stood there with her family's guilt in her hands, understanding that whatever had grown between them in that garden, in that dinner, on that terrace, might not survive what came next. She spent 6 hours locked in the East Room before the door opened again, and it was not Vittorio who came through it. It was Matteo, small and furious, having slipped past a guard distracted by the general chaos in the house, feeling his way along the hallway wall the way Elena had taught him, 3 fingers ahead, until he found her door. "Papa said not to let you in the study, but he didn't say you couldn't leave your room," Matteo said, breathless, letting himself in and closing the door behind him with the careful precision of a boy who had learned to navigate by sound rather than sight. "Is it true? Marco is saying things. That your family—" He stopped. "That your family hurt Mama." Elena knelt down, the way she had the very first day, bringing her voice level with his. "I didn't know," she said. "I promise you, Matteo, I did not know that when I came here. I found out today, same as your father did. But you came here to lie to us." The boy's unguarded face, the one that had opened for her over rose bushes and recorded laughter, had gone careful again, arranged, the way it had been the first day, and Elena felt that more sharply than she had felt almost anything in 10 weeks. "I came here to find information for my father," Elena said, refusing to soften it, because she had taught this boy not to be handled gently with the truth, and she was not going to start now, especially not now. "That part is true. But everything else, the roses, the recorder, teaching you to read a room, none of that was a lie. I didn't plan to love you, Matteo. I just did. That part isn't something I can take back, even if you decide to hate me for the rest." Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his unseeing eyes fixed slightly to the left of her, the way they always were, and then he reached out and found her hand, unerringly, the 3 thin rings of her bracelet clicking softly as her wrist turned toward him, and he held on. "I don't hate you," he said, "but Papa might." He was not wrong to worry. When Vittorio finally came to the East Room, well past midnight, he found his son asleep in the armchair beside Elena's bed, having refused to leave, and something in that image, the boy who trusted no one easily, curled up beside the woman who had lied to enter his life, seemed to cost Vittorio something to look at directly. "Your father is going to come for you," he said quietly, not moving from the doorway. "Now that he knows I know the truth about the hit, he can't afford to leave you here as a loose thread, and he can't afford to let me use what I know against him. He'll try to get you out before I can use you as leverage, or he'll try to make sure you can never testify to anyone what you found in that folder." His voice was flat, businesslike, but his eyes kept drifting to his sleeping son. "I should let him have you back and be done with this house entirely." "But you won't," Elena said, and it wasn't a question, because she had spent 10 weeks learning to read this man the way she taught his son to read a room, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever else was true, Vittorio Salvano did not want her gone. "No," he admitted, and it cost him visibly to say it. "I won't, which makes me a fool, because you came into my house under a false name to spy on the man who you believed killed your brother, and I still don't want to watch you walk out that gate." He finally looked at her fully. "Tell me the rest. Everything you found. Everything your father is planning. If we're going to survive what comes next, I need to know exactly what kind of war just walked back into my house." Elena told him everything. The folder, the manifest, the dates that proved her father had ordered the first strike, the 2 years of lies that had let an entire war be fought on the strength of a story that wasn't true. She told him about the coffee shop, the Sunday reports, the driver who waited outside, and as she spoke she watched Vittorio's face go through something complicated, not simple rage, but a grief compounding on top of older grief, the discovery that the 2 years of blood he'd spilled avenging his wife had been aimed, at least in part, at the wrong target, that somewhere beneath the war he'd waged sat a truth uglier and more useless than he'd ever imagined. That grief could be manipulated as easily as anger, that a man like her father could hide behind another man's vengeance and let it burn for years without ever paying for what he'd started. "He'll deny the folder is real," Vittorio said finally. "He'll say I planted it, that you planted it, that it's a fabrication to draw suspicion away from me. He's not a stupid man. He'll have already started building that story the moment he realizes you're not coming back with your Sunday report." "Then we need more than the folder," Elena said, and something in her voice must have surprised even her because Vittorio looked at her sharply. "I know where he keeps the originals. Not the copies you found. The real ledgers, the ones that would hold up if you brought them to the right people instead of burying them in a war. I can get them. You'd testify against your own father." "My father sent his daughter into a house with a grieving child," Elena said, "and let me believe a lie for 10 weeks so he could keep hiding behind it. He was never going to stop this war. He was going to let it burn until it took me, too, if that's what it cost to keep a secret." She held Vittorio's gaze, steady, the same way she had in that first interview, refusing to be the first to look away. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it because it's the only way this actually ends. For both our families. For him." She looked toward the sleeping boy in the armchair. "I'm not leaving him to grow up the way I did, inside a war built on a lie nobody had the courage to correct." Vittorio was quiet for a long time, looking between the sleeping boy and the woman who had lied her way into his house, and then, somehow, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, told him more truth than anyone had in 2 years. "If you do this," he said finally, "you can never go back to that family. You understand that?" "I understood that the moment I opened that folder," Elena said. The plan that came together over the following week was not the plan Elena's father had sent her to execute, and it was not the plan Vittorio's men would have chosen either, full of retribution and blood the old way. It was slower, riskier in a different sense, and it depended entirely on Elena's ability to do one final, dangerous thing. Walk back into her father's house one more time, retrieve the real ledgers from the safe only she and her father knew the combination to, and get out again before he understood what she'd become. She went on a Sunday, the way she always had, telling the driver waiting outside the coffee shop that she needed to stop at the house first, that she had something for her father that couldn't wait for their usual meeting. Her hands did not shake as she walked through the door of the house she'd grown up in, though her heart was going so hard she was certain the guards at the door could hear it. Her father was in his study when she found him, exactly as she'd known he would be, and for a moment, standing in that doorway, she felt 10 weeks fall away and became, briefly, simply his daughter again, the girl who had believed every word he told her about the family that took her brother. "You didn't call ahead," Salvatore Rossi said, not looking up from his desk. "That's not like you." "I found the manifest," Elena said, and watched her father go very still. "The one with your signature. The hit on Isabetta Salvano. You started it, Papa. All of it. 2 years of war, and it was never about them taking my brother. It was about you covering for a mistake." Her father looked up slowly, and Elena watched the same recalculation cross his face that she'd watched cross Vittorio's in the office doorway 10 days earlier, the specific expression of a dangerous man realizing the ground had shifted under him. "Whatever you think you found," he said carefully, "you don't understand the whole picture." "Then show me the real ledgers," Elena said. "Not the copy. The originals. If I'm wrong, prove it to me right now." It was, she knew even as she said it, a gamble built entirely on her father's pride, on the certainty that a man who had spent 2 years believing himself untouchable would rather prove his daughter wrong than admit she'd caught him, and it worked exactly as she'd hoped it would. Salvatore Rossi rose from his desk, crossed to the safe behind the false bookshelf that Elena had known about since she was 12 years old, and opened it to show her the truth he was so certain would exonerate him, not realizing, until it was already too late, that his daughter had not come alone. 2 of Vittorio's men, waiting outside in a car her father's guards had waved through without a second look, having recognized the Rossi girl's driver as one of their own turncoats, paid quietly over the last 3 days to look the other way, moved the moment Elena stepped back from the open safe and said the single word that had been agreed upon, enough. The hours between the word enough and the moment Elena finally left her childhood home for the last time stretched out strangely, the way danger always seemed to slow time down rather than speed it up. Her father did not go quietly. He shouted, first at the men who had appeared in his study, then at Elena herself, calling her every name a betrayed man reaches for when he has no other weapon left. Traitor, coward, her mother's daughter in the worst possible way. Elena had braced herself for this, had rehearsed standing still through it the way she'd once rehearsed her false name at the estate gates, but nothing had prepared her for the moment her father's voice cracked, just once, in the middle of the shouting, and he asked her, quiet and almost boyish, how long she had known. 10 days, she said. I've known for 10 days, and every one of them I thought about calling you first, giving you a chance to fix it yourself, to go to Vittorio and tell him the truth before I had to. You never gave me a version of yourself I could bring that offer to. She had not expected the words to cost her as much as they did, saying them, and she understood, watching her father's face crumple and then harden again into something she no longer recognized. That grief did not always look like the grief in Vittorio's garden. Sometimes it looked like this, the quiet, final closing of a door between a parent and a child who had simply run out of reasons to keep believing each other. What happened after that was not violence, not the war either family had been fighting for 2 years, but something both stranger and in its own way more final. The real ledgers, photographed and copied a dozen times over before anyone in the Rossi house understood what was happening, went not into the hands of another mob boss looking for leverage, but to a federal prosecutor Vittorio had quietly been feeding information to for over a year, hedging his own eventual exit from a life he'd never wanted his son to inherit. Salvatore Rossi did not die in that study, though Elena understood, watching her father's face as the truth of what she'd done settled over him, that some version of her, the daughter he thought he knew, had died in there instead, and would not be coming back to him. The war ended not with a funeral but with an indictment, quiet and thorough, built on paperwork rather than bullets, the kind of ending neither family had believed was possible after 2 years of blood, and in the strange, unfamiliar peace that followed, Elena found herself standing once again on the back terrace of the Salvano estate, the roses blooming properly now that spring had come. Vittorio beside her with a whiskey that he actually drank this time. He'll go to prison, Vittorio said. Not die in the street the way I always imagined ending this. Prison? He looked almost surprised by his own relief. I spent 2 years planning his death, and instead I just filed paperwork. Isabetta would have laughed at that. She'd have said it was better, Elena said. One less child growing up the way I did. One less funeral for a boy who's already been to too many. Vittorio looked at her for a long moment, the scar on his jaw catching the last of the evening light, and something in his face had changed permanently since that night in the office doorway. Some final piece of the ledger-eyed man dissolved for good. I told myself, the day I hired you, that I was choosing you because Matteo needed someone who wasn't afraid of him, he said. I didn't understand until much later that I think some part of me recognized you before I had any right to. Before I knew your name was a lie, some part of me already trusted the woman underneath it. That's either the most romantic thing you've ever said, Elena said, or you're about to tell me my father's lawyers are here. Vittorio laughed, the real one, the 4-second one Matteo had once treasured on a small recorder as though it were rare gold, except now it went on far longer than 4 seconds, long enough that Matteo, hearing it from the garden below where he was tracing the new roses with careful fingers, looked up in the direction of the sound with a smile that needed no eyes to be understood. Elena, he called out. Come feel this one. It's a different kind of soft. She went down to him, leaving Vittorio on the terrace with his whiskey and his unfamiliar piece, and knelt beside the boy in the garden, and let him guide her hand to a new bloom, armor giving way, as it always did, to something soft and secret underneath. In the weeks that followed the indictment, the house went through a strange, uncertain adjustment, the way a body does after a long fever finally breaks. Vittorio began, slowly and without announcing it to anyone, stepping back from pieces of the business he had once guarded jealously, handing routes and territories to men he trusted, quietly funneling other operations toward legitimate fronts that Renata the accountant, it turned out, had been begging him to build for years without much success. He never told Elena directly that he was doing it for Matteo, or for her, but she noticed the Tuesday and Thursday cars came less often, and then almost not at all, and she noticed that when Vittorio came home in the evenings now, he came home earlier, and he came home without the particular tension in his shoulders that used to announce, before he'd even said a word, exactly what kind of day it had been. Matteo noticed it too, in his own way. Papa's steps are different, he told Elena one afternoon, tracing his fingers along the piano keys she'd finally convinced Vittorio to have tuned, an instrument that had sat untouched since Isabetta died. Lighter, like he's not carrying the bad thing anymore. What bad thing? Elena asked, though she thought she already knew. The thing that made him quiet at dinner, Matteo said, working out a slow, uncertain melody with one hand. I used to think it was about Mama, but I don't think that's it anymore. I think he was scared all the time, and now he isn't as scared. Elena sat beside him on the piano bench and helped him find the harmony to go with his melody, 2 hands instead of 1, and did not tell him that the fear he'd been hearing in his father's footsteps for 2 years had a name and a face and had, for a little while, been her own family's doing. Some truths, she had decided, belonged to the adults who had made them, and this was one she would carry so that Matteo never had to. 6 months later, the Salvano estate looked less like a fortress and more like a home. The guards were fewer now, the gates less often closed, and on a warm evening in early summer, the house held something it had not held in over 2 years. A birthday party, small and unguarded, string lights strung through the garden trees by Matteo's own careful direction, since he insisted he knew exactly how far apart they should be by the sound of the wind moving through them. Elena stood at the edge of the garden watching Vittorio kneel in the grass beside his son, both of them laughing at something neither adult in that house 2 years ago would have believed possible, and when Vittorio looked up and found her watching, he didn't look away, and neither did she. She had come to that house to destroy a man, and had instead learned to see one clearly for the first time, the way his son had once learned to see the world without his eyes at all, not through the surface, not through the armor, but through the soft, secret truth underneath, the one worth all the danger it took to reach. Sometimes the family you're taught to hate is the one you're meant to save, and sometimes the truth you go looking for turns out to be smaller and far more human than the war built on top of it. If this story kept you guessing until the very end, let me know in the comments which twist you saw coming and which one caught you off guard. Like this video if you believe love can survive even the ugliest secrets. Share it with someone who loves a slow burn redemption story. And subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for watching.